Cold Shadows, A Ghost Whisperers of Portsmouth Cozy Paranormal Mystery, Book 0, written by Lisa Bouchard, Chapter 1. Thea. The musty scent of old books greeted me as I walked through the library of Proctor House. Morning light filtered through dusty stained-glass windows, casting prisms of color across the dark wood floorboards. I paused to run my fingers over the mahogany bookshelf, tracing the ornate scrollwork carved into its surface. "Thea," my cousin Delia's voice echoed from the kitchen down the hall. "You're finally up." I followed the smell of freshly brewed coffee toward her voice. "It's barely past 9, I said, stifling a yawn. "Hardly late for a Saturday." Delia stood at the stove frying eggs, her blonde hair swept up in a messy bun. At the sound of my voice, she glanced over her shoulder, blue eyes glinting with mischief. "We've got a full day ahead. I want to check out that new antiques shop on Market Street after breakfast." I sat at the kitchen table, inhaling the scents of sizzling bacon and toasted cinnamon raisin bread. Through the window, I could see the side yard, finally free of winter snow. Proctor House had been in our family for generations. For over 300 years, Proctors had walked these creaking floorboards, gathered around this table, gazed out at the harbor just visible down the hill. Portsmouth was our home, filled with history, mystery, and more than a few secrets. I poured a cup of coffee and took a long sip, savoring the rich aroma. "Don't forget, we've got a harbor tour this afternoon." Delia slid the eggs from pan to plate with a flick of her wrist, a touch of magic in the motion. "Right, the 1 o'clock tour. We should probably go over the route again." I nodded. Our tour company, Port City Tours, now specialized in haunted history expeditions around Portsmouth. My cousin and I leveraged our unique abilities to give our customers a one-of-a-kind experience. The amulets we'd received from the sorority of Bridget allowed us to see ghosts, so we knew our tours were the most authentic. Delia brought 2 loaded plates to the table and sat down across from me. "I did some research on that widower who jumped off the cliff back in the 1700s. People say his ghost still paces the overlook." My mind was already spinning with possibilities. Our next tour could take that seaside path. I wondered if his ghost was still there. Our clients would love the tragic love story either way. This business was our passion. The tourists adored our eerie adventures through old Portsmouth, and for Delia and me, it was about more than making a living. It was about honoring our heritage and giving ghosts a chance to be heard. I smiled as I watched Jules bat playfully at her sister Jessamine's tail. Our black cat familiars were still kittens, but it was her job to train us in the proper use of the amulets. Jessamine returned the gentle swipes, her white-tipped tail twitching. "We should bring them along," Delia said, following my gaze. "They're getting good at showing up in time to scare the tourists." I laughed. "Yeah, they're great partners in crime." Jules turned her bright green eyes my way as if waiting for me to elaborate. I winked at her. "Don't pretend you're so innocent," I teased. "I know your mischievous side." Jules meowed in protest. I reached down to scratch her head, feeling the deep rumble of her purr. No matter how much chaos she caused, I couldn't stay mad at her. Familiars were gifts, playful, perceptive, and perfectly attuned to our magic. Delia smiled at Jessamine, who had curled up contentedly in her lap. "All right, back to business," Delia said. "We should do a quick walk-through before the tour." I nodded, scooping up Jules. It was time to give our clients a tour they'd never forget. "A quick walk-through sounds good," I said, tucking Jules into the crook of my arm. "We can check for any, lingering guests along the route." Delia grinned, knowing I meant ghosts. Our abilities allowed us to see and speak with spirits, though we had to be discreet when others were around. To most, the supernatural was something to fear. For us, it was part of everyday life. I glanced at my watch, the morning sun glinting off its etched pentagram face. "We'd better get moving if we want to finish before the tour." Delia nodded, setting Jessamine down gently. "I'll have to look at the antiques another day." The black cats trailed behind us as we headed for the foyer. "Remember when we tried to sled down these stairs?" Delia asked with a laugh. I groaned. How could I forget? My tailbone was bruised for a week. But it was worth it for the look on Grandma's face, Delia said mischievously. Some things never changed. We were adults now, but still got that same thrill from our schemes. I unlocked the front door and swung it open, letting in the salty ocean breeze. Seagulls cried out as they soared above the front lawn. The smell of the sea mingled with the scent decaying leaves we hadn't raked up last autumn. I stepped outside with Delia close behind. Our familiars darted past us, already beginning their morning exploration. "All right, let's start loading up," I said. We headed for the detached garage which housed our tour van. The old white van had definitely seen better days, but it got the job done. I slid open the side door, grabbing folded tables and chairs. We wouldn't need them for our walking tour. Satisfied we had everything, I did one last check. My necklace with its ghost-revealing amulet, my spirit boxes which let us know when ghosts were near, and most importantly, our tour maps. Delia started the van. Today's tour was going to be something special, I could feel it. With our sights set on the city, we pulled away, ready for a day of haunts and history. The real fun was about to begin. We drove our route, making sure there hadn't been any big changes that would require us to change the tour. Satisfied everything would go smoothly, we went to pick up the day's tourists at the our office. As I parked, I saw a familiar face waiting eagerly on the sidewalk. "Good morning, Mrs. Peters," I called out, ready for some spectral sightseeing. "Oh yes, dear, I've been looking forward to this all week," she replied, climbing into the van. 7 other tourists climbed in after her, looking excited for their tour. Mrs. Peters was one of our most loyal customers, a sweet older lady with a fascination for the paranormal. She came on nearly every tour, oohing and ahing at cold spots and all our haunted stories. As we drove, I gave a quick overview of the building we'd be visiting. Today's tour is in the Portsmouth Athenaeum, and I'm sure we'll find some ghostly activity there. "I hear footsteps every time I visit the 2nd floor," Mrs. Peters said. "We'll be sure to thoroughly investigate the source of those phantom footsteps," I replied with a grin. Soon we pulled up to the Athenaeum, an imposing brick building from the 1800s. As we entered, I set up Delia's spirit box, turning it on to scan rapidly through stations. Static filled the air. Mrs. Peters clung to my arm. "Anything yet, dear?" she asked hopefully. "Not yet, but we've only been here for a few minutes," I said with a playful wink. I smiled reassuringly at Mrs. Peters as we headed for the stairwell. This was always the highlight of our tours, the chance for guests to experience potential paranormal activity firsthand. As we climbed the creaky wooden steps, I described the building's history, rumors of its hauntings, and my own brushes with the supernatural here while Delia and I were setting up our new tours. Mrs. Peters listened intently, eyes wide, even though she'd heard the story at least a dozen times before. At the top landing, we paused. "Feel free to walk around and explore," I invited the group, "and let me know if you experience anything out of the ordinary." I stayed close to Mrs. Peters as she wandered the dim hallway. The spirit box sputtered in the background. Suddenly, Mrs. Peters gasped and grabbed my wrist. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. From the darkness came a distinct footfall, as if an invisible person walked by. "I did," I said. "The Athenaeum's resident ghost seems active today." Mrs. Peters shuddered, equal parts thrilled and unnerved. As we descended the stairs, she chattered excitedly about the footsteps, voicing her theories on their source. I smiled to myself, happy to provide Mrs. Peters and the others with an authentic paranormal experience. Though I knew the Athenaeum's secrets, their wonder and curiosity always had me excited to return. I nodded along to Mrs. Peters' eager speculation about the ghostly footsteps we'd heard. Though I knew the true source, I didn't want to shatter her illusion. The Athenaeum had been haunted for decades by the spirit of a young librarian who met her untimely demise in the stacks. Only Delia and I knew who the ghost in the stacks was, because we'd talked to her ourselves. As we stepped outside, the brisk air was a welcome relief from the stuffy interior. I gathered the tour group to recap the afternoon and invite feedback. Most recounted intense paranormal experiences, unexplained noises, eerie sensations, flickering shadows. Their excitement was palpable. "Well, I certainly won't be visiting the Athenaeum alone anytime soon," quipped a middle-aged man with a nervous chuckle. Others murmured in agreement. I smiled. "I'm not sure that kind of precaution is necessary. The Athenaeum's ghosts aren't malevolent and won't hurt you. Thanks for joining the tour. I hope you've gained a new appreciation for Portsmouth's haunted history. As the group dispersed, I noticed Zelda Dalton, owner of Eerie Tours, Portsmouth's only other ghost tour company, watching from across the street. She shot me a glare before slinking off into the darkness. Zelda and I had an ongoing rivalry, competing for customers. Lately, her tactics had become more cutthroat. I'd have to keep an eye on her. For now, though, I reveled in another successful haunted tour, thankful for our curious guests and timeless ghosts. I waved goodbye to the last of the tour guests and turned to Delia. "Another great day," I said. "Seems like word is spreading about our tours." Delia nodded enthusiastically. "Totally. Did you see how freaked out they all were in the stacks? I swear I heard some other ghosts, too." "Yeah, the Athenaeum always delivers a paranormal punch," I chuckled. We drove the van the 2 blocks to our office, then started walking toward Proctor House, cutting through the busy streets. "So what's the deal with Zelda lurking around?" Delia asked. She looked ready to hex us both. I sighed. Clearly she's not happy about our success. Delia scoffed. "Oh, please, like she could run a better ghost tour than us, even if she tried. We're actual witches, not just faking it." "Shh, keep your voice down," I cautioned, scanning the sidewalks around us. Delia lowered her voice. "Right, sorry, but still, we have the upper hand ghostwise." I nodded. "Yes, but let's not underestimate her. Desperate people do desperate things." We walked in thoughtful silence for a few minutes. As we turned onto Market Street, nearing Proctor House, an eerie fog rolled in, obscuring the road ahead. A tingle ran down my spine. Something wasn't right. I grabbed Delia's arm, my senses on high alert. She gave me a questioning look, but stayed quiet. The fog thickened until we could barely see a foot in front of us. An ominous energy permeated the haze. "Something's happening," I said. Delia shivered beside me. Suddenly, a shadowy figure emerged from the fog. I gasped, protectively moving in front of Delia. Chapter 2. Delia. The shadowy figure materialized into our cousin as she stepped closer. I let out the breath I'd been holding and released the protection spell I was about to cast. "Isabella," Thea said, hand to her chest. "You scared us half to death." Isabella chuckled, her dark hair spilling over her shoulders. "I'm sorry. I wanted to check your reflexes. Think of it as an early April Fool's Day joke." We walked back to Proctor House, the fog dissipating around us. Inside, Grandpa Earl's ghostly form waited in the kitchen. I wished I could give him a hug, but I knew my arms would just go through him. "How was the tour?" he asked. Before we could answer, Thea's cat Jules leapt onto the counter, swatting at Earl playfully. Her paw also passed right through him. "One of these days I'll get you," Earl grumbled to Jules. I laughed. The tour was great. The Athenaeum footsteps really spooked Mrs. Peters. Grandpa laughed. She always was a jittery woman. "Bye, Grandpa," Isabella said as she walked off, bored because she couldn't see or hear Grandpa. Only Thea and I had the defective amulets that allowed us to see ghosts. Despite the supernatural forces at work, it felt like any other family gathering. Almost normal. Thea and I finished regaling Grandpa Earl with the details of our tour. As we wound down, an uneasy expression crossed his translucent face. He fidgeted with his ghostly sleeves, clearly working up the nerve to ask us something. "What's up, Grandpa?" I prodded. He sighed. "I hate to ask this of you girls, but I could really use your help." Thea and I exchanged a glance. Helping people was part of the family creed, but he rarely made requests of his own. This must be important. "Of course, anything," Thea said. He nodded, floating to sit on the edge of the kitchen table. "You know the house next door?" I pictured the quaint Victorian with the overgrown rose bushes. It had always given me an uneasy vibe, even as a child. "There's a spirit trap there. A woman murdered in her own home over 40 years ago, unsolved, poor thing." He turned back to face us, his expression mournful. "Her name is Margaret Sinclair. She was a friend of the family, back when we were both still, well, you know. For a long time now, she's been the only person I could talk to, and she's very unhappy. She's stuck where she is, either in the house or in the yard, unable to move on." I don't know how to banish a ghost, I said. Wouldn't you need an exorcist or something like that? Grandpa shook his head. Exorcists are for demons. What do you want us to do? Thea asked. We've been talking and we think if her murderer is brought to justice, she'll be able to move on. I'm hoping you find who killed her so she can find peace. I met Thea's gaze. This wouldn't be easy, but turning away a soul in need wasn't our style. We're in, I said. Grandpa's shoulders sagged in relief. Thank you, girls. I know it's a lot to take on, but I can't bear to see her suffering anymore. Don't worry, Grandpa, we've got this, Thea assured him. He managed a sad smile. I know you do. Now come on, let's go meet Margaret. My stomach fluttered with anticipation. A new spirit, a new mystery. Isabella wasn't the only person solving crime anymore. Thea and I followed him out the back door and into the yard. Fog still clung to the lawn, swirling around our feet as we made our way toward the fence separating our property from Margaret's old home. Even from the outside, I could feel a heaviness surrounding the place. The weight of Margaret's lingering spirit hung over it like a dark cloud. As we drew closer, the hairs on my arms stood on end. Margaret? He called out gently. It's me, Earl. I've brought people who want to help you. For a moment, all was still and silent. Then, before our eyes, a figure began to emerge from the mist. The ghostly form of a woman materialized, her features hazy at first, then sharpening into focus. She appeared exactly as she must have in life, a petite brunette dressed in a simple floral dress and cardigan. Her hair was styled in soft curls framing her heart-shaped face. But while she seemed youthful and lovely, her eyes held a profound sadness that cut straight to my core. Earl, her voice echoed as if traveling a great distance. You came back. Of course, he replied. Margaret, I want you to meet the girls, Thea and Delia. They have a special gift. They've offered to help solve your murder so you can move on. Margaret studied us curiously. You can see me and hear me. Yes, ma'am, Thea answered. We're so sorry for what happened to you. If there's anything we can do to help, we want to try. The ghost managed a faint smile. That's kind of you, but I'm afraid even I don't know who killed me, or why. She sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping. I've been trapped here so long with no answers. I had hoped my husband would find justice, but he wasn't able. He couldn't bear living here anymore. A tear slipped down her translucent cheek. I just want to understand why this happened. I want to be at peace. Don't worry, Margaret, I said, steeling my resolve. We're going to figure this out. Thea nodded firmly in agreement as Grandpa beamed proudly at us both. The girls are right, he told Margaret. We'll get to the bottom of this, together. She managed a real smile then, the first light of hope entering her eyes. In that moment, I knew we would move heaven and earth if that's what it took to solve Margaret's murder. The spirit would be trapped no more. I wish I could tell you what happened, she said, but I can't remember anything about the day I died. Let us look into it and we'll keep you updated. Solving murders has become something of a family pastime, so I'm sure we'll have an answer for you soon. I blinked and there he was, Grandpa Earl's ghostly form hovering at the foot of my bed. Rise and shine, sleepyhead, he said in his familiar, raspy voice. We've got work to do. I groaned and pulled my quilt up over my head. Thea and I had been up late looking at everything we could find about Margaret Sinclair's murder. It was barely dawn and already Grandpa wanted help with some harebrained scheme. Don't get me wrong, I love the old guy, but his antics could be exhausting, doubly so now that he didn't need sleep. Come on, up and at 'em, Grandpa insisted, wafting through my cozy quilt barrier. We've got to get an early start if we're going to work on your grandmother's birthday surprise without her knowing about it. At the mention of Grandma, I tossed off my covers and sat up, shivering as my feet hit the cold wood floor. Aunt Nadia's making a cake and we've all got presents for her. What else did you want to do? I asked Grandpa. His translucent face lit up. I want to do something real nice for your grandma's birthday next week. Something that lets her know how much I still love her. He rambled on eagerly about his ideas while I rubbed the sleep from my eyes. Grandpa's enthusiasm was endearing, but planning anything for Grandma without her catching on would be tricky. She noticed everything that happened in this creaky old house. Still, how could I say no? If anyone deserved a celebration, it was Grandma. Making Grandpa's ghost happy in the process would be an added bonus. I'd have to talk to Delia, but I was sure we could scheme up something special for Grandma Esther's big day. I nodded slowly as Grandpa's ghost floated before me, outlining his grand plan to surprise Grandma Esther for her birthday. It was a sweet gesture, but knowing my grandmother, pulling it off wouldn't be easy. I don't know, Grandpa, I said hesitantly. You know how Grandma is. She notices everything that happens in this house. I'm not sure how we'd plan a secret party without her catching on. Grandpa's translucent face fell. Oh, I know it's a tall order, but now that you girls can see and hear me, I can finally do something real special for Esther this year. Make her feel loved on her big day. His voice took on a wistful tone. My heart twinged. Grandpa had been dead for years now, but his devotion to Grandma hadn't wavered one bit. How could I refuse his earnest request? Well, maybe we could do something small. I relented. I'll talk to Thea. Maybe you could dictate little notes about everything you've wanted to say over the past years but haven't been able to. Grandpa's eyes lit up, his spirit brightening. Oh, that would be just perfect. He floated over and planted a cold, ghostly kiss on my cheek. Bless you, Delia. You've always been my favorite, you know. And there are a few gifts I want you to pick up for her, too. I smiled weakly, wondering what I had gotten myself into. Pulling one over on Grandma wouldn't be a cakewalk, but the joy on Grandpa's face made it all worthwhile. This would be one birthday Grandma Esther would never forget. Ed, I'll think up some notes letting her know she's as beautiful and vibrant as the day we first met. His voice grew wistful again. Maybe mention some of our best memories over the years, too. Our first date at the ice cream parlor, our wedding day. He trailed off, lost in memory. I gave him a moment before gently prodding. That all sounds great, but we'll have to be subtle with the notes so she doesn't get suspicious. I tapped my pen against my chin. Maybe I can sneak them into the books she's reading or tuck them into her knitting bag. Grandpa nodded eagerly. Perfect! You always were a clever girl. We hammered out a few more details, when to deliver each gift, where to hide the notes. Before long, we had devised a thorough plan of attack. As Grandpa floated off to start composing his love notes, I let out a slow breath. This covert operation would require some serious stealth, but seeing Grandpa's unrestrained joy made all the effort worthwhile. I headed downstairs to find Thea and fill her in on the scheme. She was curled up on the window seat in the living room, absently stroking Jules's fur as she drank a cup of coffee. Hey, I said, plopping down beside her. Got a minute? She glanced over, one eyebrow raised. That depends. Are you planning anything that might get us in trouble? I laughed. No, nothing like that. I just talked to Grandpa and he wants our help with something for Grandma. I quickly explained his plan to secretly romance her with flowers and notes. Thea's eyes widened. That's so sweet. Then she frowned. But won't she get suspicious if we start leaving anonymous gifts all of a sudden? That's what I thought, so we'll have to be really careful about how we do it without her catching on. I outlined the ideas I'd come up with so far. We spent the next half hour scheming up ways to stealthily romance Grandma on Grandpa's behalf. By the end, we had an impressive plan. As we wrapped up, Thea shook her head with a smile. The things we do for family. Okay, Operation Romance is a go, I said. Thea laughed. We've got time this morning, let's go buy some presents. With a spring in our steps, we headed out to put Operation Romance into action. Over the next few days, we continued to secretly brighten Grandma's days with small tokens of affection. A sweet note slipped into her novel, chocolate truffles on her pillow, her favorite tea waiting bedside each morning. And with each gesture, we were rewarded by Grandma's glow of joy. The light in her eyes, her delighted laughter, the pep in her step. She seemed years younger. One evening, Grandpa's voice spoke behind us. Girls, I can't thank you enough. You've made my Esther so very happy. Her smile has been a balm to my soul. His voice was thick with emotion. Delia and I hugged him, sharing in his happiness. It was our pleasure, Grandpa, I said. We'd do anything for you and Grandma. Chapter 2. Delia. The shadowy figure materialized into our cousin as she stepped closer. I let out the breath I'd been holding and released the protection spell I was about to cast. "Isabella," Thea said, hand to her chest. "You scared us half to death." Isabella chuckled, her dark hair spilling over her shoulders. "I'm sorry. I wanted to check your reflexes. Think of it as an early April Fool's Day joke." We walked back to Proctor House, the fog dissipating around us. Inside, Grandpa Earl's ghostly form waited in the kitchen. I wished I could give him a hug, but I knew my arms would just go through him. "How was the tour?" he asked. Before we could answer, Thea's cat Jules leapt onto the counter, swatting at Earl playfully. Her paw also passed right through him. "One of these days I'll get you," Earl grumbled to Jules. I laughed. The tour was great. The Athenaeum footsteps really spooked Mrs. Peters. Grandpa laughed. She always was a jittery woman. "Bye, Grandpa," Isabella said as she walked off, bored because she couldn't see or hear Grandpa. Only Thea and I had the defective amulets that allowed us to see ghosts. Despite the supernatural forces at work, it felt like any other family gathering. Almost normal. Thea and I finished regaling Grandpa Earl with the details of our tour. As we wound down, an uneasy expression crossed his translucent face. He fidgeted with his ghostly sleeves, clearly working up the nerve to ask us something. "What's up, Grandpa?" I prodded. He sighed. "I hate to ask this of you girls, but I could really use your help." Thea and I exchanged a glance. Helping people was part of the family creed, but he rarely made requests of his own. This must be important. "Of course, anything," Thea said. He nodded, floating to sit on the edge of the kitchen table. "You know the house next door?" I pictured the quaint Victorian with the overgrown rose bushes. It had always given me an uneasy vibe, even as a child. "There's a spirit trapped there. A woman murdered in her own home over 40 years ago. Unsolved, poor thing." He turned back to face us, his expression mournful. "Her name is Margaret Sinclair. She was a friend of the family, back when we were both still, well, you know. For a long time now, she's been the only person I could talk to, and she's very unhappy. She's stuck where she is, either in the house or in the yard, unable to move on." "I don't know how to banish a ghost," I said. "Wouldn't you need an exorcist or something like that?" Grandpa shook his head. "Exorcists are for demons." "What do you want us to do?" Thea asked. "We've been talking, and we think if her murderer is brought to justice, she'll be able to move on. I'm hoping you find who killed her, so she can find peace." I met Thea's gaze. This wouldn't be easy, but turning away a soul in need wasn't our style. "We're in," I said. Grandpa's shoulders sagged in relief. "Thank you, girls. I know it's a lot to take on, but I can't bear to see her suffering anymore." "Don't worry, Grandpa, we've got this," Thea assured him. He managed a sad smile. "I know you do. Now come on, let's go meet Margaret." My stomach fluttered with anticipation. A new spirit. A new mystery. Isabella wasn't the only person solving crime anymore. Thea and I followed him out the back door and into the yard. Fog still clung to the lawn, swirling around our feet as we made our way toward the fence separating our property from Margaret's old home. Even from the outside, I could feel a heaviness surrounding the place. The weight of Margaret's lingering spirit hung over it like a dark cloud. As we drew closer, the hairs on my arms stood on end. "Margaret?" he called out gently. "It's me, Earl. I've brought people who want to help you." For a moment, all was still and silent. Then before our eyes, a figure began to emerge from the mist. The ghostly form of a woman materialized, her features hazy at first, then sharpening into focus. She appeared exactly as she must have in life, a petite brunette dressed in a simple floral dress and cardigan. Her hair was styled in soft curls framing her heart-shaped face. But while she seemed youthful and lovely, her eyes held a profound sadness that cut straight to my core. "Earl?" Her voice echoed as if traveling a great distance. "You came back?" "Of course," he replied. "Margaret, I want you to meet the girls, Thea and Delia. They have a special gift. They've offered to help solve your murder so you can move on." Margaret studied us curiously. "You can see me and hear me?" "Yes, ma'am," Thea answered. "We're so sorry for what happened to you. If there's anything we can do to help, we want to try." The ghost managed a faint smile. "That's kind of you. but I'm afraid even I don't know who killed me, or why." She sighed deeply, her shoulders slumping. "I've been trapped here so long with no answers. I had hoped my husband would find justice, but he wasn't able. He couldn't bear living here anymore." A tear slipped down her translucent cheek. "I just want to understand why this happened. I want to be at peace." "Don't worry, Margaret," I said, steeling my resolve. "We're going to figure this out." Thea nodded firmly in agreement as Grandpa beamed proudly at us both. "The girls are right," he told Margaret. "We'll get to the bottom of this, together." She managed a real smile then, the first light of hope entering her eyes. In that moment I knew we would move heaven and earth if that's what it took to solve Margaret's murder. This spirit would be trapped no more. "I wish I could tell you what happened," she said, "but I can't remember anything about the day I died. Let us look into it and we'll keep you updated. Solving murders has become something of a family pastime, so I'm sure we'll have an answer for you soon." I blinked and there he was, Grandpa Earl's ghostly form hovering at the foot of my bed. "Rise and shine, sleepyhead," he said in his familiar, raspy voice. "We've got work to do." I groaned and pulled my quilt up over my head. Thea and I had been up late looking at everything we could find about Margaret Sinclair's murder. It was barely dawn and already Grandpa wanted help with some harebrained scheme. Don't get me wrong, I loved the old guy, but his antics could be exhausting. Doubly so now that he didn't need sleep. "Come on, up and at 'em," Grandpa insisted, wafting through my cozy quilt barrier. "We've got to get an early start if we're going to work on your grandmother's birthday surprise without her knowing about it." At the mention of Grandma, I tossed off my covers and sat up, shivering as my feet hit the cold wood floor. "Aunt Nadia's making a cake and we've all got presents for her. What else did you want to do?" I asked Grandpa. His translucent face lit up. "I want to do something real nice for your grandma's birthday next week. Something that lets her know how much I still love her." He rambled on eagerly about his ideas while I rubbed the sleep from my eyes. Grandpa's enthusiasm was endearing, but planning anything for Grandma without her catching on would be tricky. She noticed everything that happened in this creaky old house. Still, how could I say no? If anyone deserved a celebration, it was Grandma. Making Grandpa's ghost happy in the process would be an added bonus. I'd have to talk to Delia, but I was sure we could scheme up something special for Grandma Esther's big day. I nodded slowly as Grandpa's ghost floated before me, outlining his grand plan to surprise Grandma Esther for her birthday. It was a sweet gesture, but knowing my grandmother, pulling it off wouldn't be easy. "I don't know, Grandpa," I said hesitantly. "You know how Grandma is. She notices everything that happens in this house. I'm not sure how we'd plan a secret party without her catching on." Grandpa's translucent face fell. "Oh, I know it's a tall order, but now that you girls can see and hear me, I can finally do something real special for Esther this year. Make her feel loved on her big day." His voice took on a wistful tone. My heart twinged. Grandpa had been dead for years now, but his devotion to Grandma hadn't wavered one bit. How could I refuse his earnest request? "Well, maybe we could do something small," I relented. "I'll talk to Thea. Maybe you could dictate little notes about everything you've wanted to say over the past years but haven't been able to." Grandpa's eyes lit up, his spirit brightening. Oh, that would be just perfect. He floated over and planted a cold, ghostly kiss on my cheek. "Bless you, Delia. You've always been my favorite, you know. And there are a few gifts I want you to pick up for her, too." I smiled weakly, wondering what I had gotten myself into. Pulling one over on Grandma wouldn't be a cakewalk, but the joy on Grandpa's face made it all worthwhile. This would be one birthday Grandma Esther would never forget. I'll think up some notes letting her know she's as beautiful and vibrant as the day we first met. His voice grew wistful again. Maybe mention some of our best memories over the years, too. Our first date at the ice cream parlor, our wedding day. He trailed off, lost in memory. I gave him a moment before gently prodding. "That all sounds great, but we'll have to be subtle with the notes so she doesn't get suspicious." I tapped my pen against my chin. "Maybe I can sneak them into the books she's reading or tuck them into her knitting bag." Grandpa nodded eagerly. "Perfect. You always were a clever girl." We hammered out a few more details, when to deliver each gift, where to hide the notes. Before long, we had devised a thorough plan of attack. As Grandpa floated off to start composing his love notes, I let out a slow breath. This covert operation would require some serious stealth, but seeing Grandpa's unrestrained joy made all the effort worthwhile. I headed downstairs to find Thea and fill her in on the scheme. She was curled up on the window seat in the living room, absently stroking Jules' fur as she drank a cup of coffee. "Hey," I said, plopping down beside her. "Got a minute?" She glanced over, one eyebrow raised. "That depends. Are you planning anything that might get us in trouble?" I laughed. "No, nothing like that. I just talked to Grandpa and he wants our help with something for Grandma." I quickly explained his plan to secretly romance her with flowers and notes. Thea's eyes widened. "That's so sweet." Then she frowned. "But won't she get suspicious if we start leaving anonymous gifts all of a sudden?" "That's what I thought, so we'll have to be really careful about how we do it without her catching on." I outlined the ideas I'd come up with so far. We spent the next half hour scheming up ways to stealthily romance Grandma on Grandpa's behalf. By the end, we had an impressive plan. As we wrapped up, Thea shook her head with a smile. "The things we do for family." "Okay, Operation Romance is a go," I said. Thea laughed. "We've got time this morning, let's go buy some presents." With a spring in our steps, we headed out to put Operation Romance into action. Over the next few days, we continued to secretly brighten Grandma's days with small tokens of affection. A sweet note slipped into her novel, chocolate truffles on her pillow, her favorite tea waiting bedside each morning, and with each gesture we were rewarded by Grandma's glow of joy. The light in her eyes, her delighted laughter, the pep in her step. She seemed years younger. One evening, Grandpa's voice spoke behind us. "Girls, I can't thank you enough. You've made my Esther so very happy. Her smile has been a balm to my soul." His voice was thick with emotion. Delia and I hugged him, sharing in his happiness. "It was our pleasure, Grandpa," I said. "We'd do anything for you and Grandma." Chapter 3. Thea. I stood at the window staring out at the old Victorian house next door. Margaret Sinclair's house. Even in the light of day, a dark energy radiated from it. Last night, we'd promised to bring her killer to justice. Now we had to make good on that promise. My stomach churned with apprehension. Solving a 40-year-old murder wouldn't be easy, especially without letting anyone outside the family know we could talk to ghosts. But Grandpa was counting on us. I turned to Delia. "We need to get inside that house. There may still be clues there." Delia nodded. "I have an idea. Let's add it to our list of haunted houses for the tour business. That'll give us a reason to snoop around." I smiled, impressed by her cunning. Our haunted tour business gave us access to creepy old houses for research. In this case, our real purpose was looking for ghosts and solving mysteries. Good thinking. We can say we're scoping it out for a future tour. No one will suspect we're actually investigating Margaret's murder, I said. Delia grinned. This could be our most exciting tour yet. A real unsolved mystery with clues hidden inside the actual crime scene. People will eat it up. I laughed. You're right, and we get to play super sleuth in the process. I picked up my laptop bag. Let's go ask the new owner for permission to tour the house. I took a deep breath as we walked up the driveway of the looming Victorian house, where Margaret had been murdered. Even in the cheerful afternoon sunlight, a shadow seemed to hang over it. Remember, we're just a couple of entrepreneurs researching a future haunted tour, I whispered to Delia as we approached the door. We're interested in facts about the house history and decor. The murder is irrelevant. Delia nodded, looking nervous but determined. We walked up the creaky front steps. I raised my hand to knock, hesitating. Were we really doing this? Sticking our noses into a brutal, cold case based on the word of a ghost? Before I could overthink it further, the heavy oak door swung open. A tall, slender woman with iron-gray hair peered out at us. Yes? She asked sharply. I plastered a bright smile on my face. Hi there. I'm Thea, and this is my business partner Delia. We run Port City tours, and we're interested in featuring your home on an upcoming tour. The woman's eyes narrowed. Don't you live next door? And why on earth would I allow a tour in my house? This is my private residence. Thinking fast, I said, well, the history of the house is so fascinating. We think our clients would love to learn more about its unique architecture and heritage. Its sordid history, you mean? She sniffed, but she stepped aside. I suppose you may come in briefly, but only to see there's nothing worth bringing people in for. Delia and I stepped into the foyer, glancing around. Despite the bright sunlight outside, inside the house was dim and shadowy. Heavy velvet drapes blocked the windows, and the only light came from a few ornate sconces on the walls. My skin prickled. The atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive, as if ghosts of the past still lingered. "My name is Regina Thornton," said the woman who let us in. She shut the front door with a thud that made me jump. "I'm the current owner of this property." "It's lovely to meet you," I said, hoping my voice didn't shake. Regina's lips twitched. "I doubt that. Most people find this house disturbing. But I suppose that appeals to your morbid sensibilities. I've heard stories about your family." I bit my tongue, resisting the urge to snap back. We needed to stay on Regina's good side. "May we see the upstairs?" Delia piped up. "Specifically the bedroom where the sordid incident occurred?" Regina raised one thin eyebrow. "You mean the murder scene? I suppose I shouldn't be surprised you're interested in that." She sighed. "Very well, but don't touch anything." She led us up the curved staircase. With each step, my nerves wound tighter. We were about to stand in the very room where Margaret had been killed. At the top of the stairs, Regina gestured to a closed door. "There, satisfy your ghoulish curiosity." I reached for the crystal doorknob with a slightly shaking hand. The door creaked open. Delia gripped my arm. My breath caught in my throat. The bedroom had been turned into a sewing room. Margaret floated into view. "I can show you what the room looks like after I died, if you want." Delia, thinking fast, started to cough. "Oh my goodness! Could I bother you for a glass of water, Mrs. Thornton?" Regina frowned and opened the door next to her sewing room. She stepped back so she could keep her eye on both Delia and me. "Be quick about it." As Delia ran the tap, I whispered, "Yes," to Margaret. I stepped further into the room, a chill running down my spine. This was where Margaret had spent her final moments, where she had struggled against her killer. Margaret cast a translucent image across the room, half obscuring the sewing machine, dress form, and shelves of fabric currently there. I tried to focus on the image and ignore reality. My gaze landed on the antique vanity, its surface covered in Margaret's jewelry, perfume bottles, and makeup. A hairbrush with long auburn strands still tangled in the bristles, a tube of lipstick, the rich red shade. Next to the vanity, the ornate four-poster bed stood in disarray, bedsheets strewn across the hardwood floor. I pictured Margaret's body splayed across the mattress, nylons knotted around her slender neck. Delia let out a small gasp. She was staring at the floor near the foot of the bed. I followed her gaze and sucked in a sharp breath. There, partially obscured by the fallen sheets, were dark stains marring the wood. My stomach churned with equal parts sadness and anger. Margaret had been so full of life and warmth. For her murder to go unsolved for decades felt fundamentally wrong. I squared my shoulders, blinking back tears. We would find who did this to her. We had to. "Have you seen enough yet? I told you there's nothing left of that gruesome murder." I tore my eyes away from the bloodstains, giving the room one last sweeping glance. Whoever killed Margaret had been clever, leaving barely a shred of evidence behind. But they had made one crucial mistake. They hadn't counted on Delia and I getting involved. "Of course," I said. "We're sorry for disturbing you." We thanked Regina for allowing us access to the house and made our way outside, eager to pursue the next thread of our investigation. "Where to now?" Delia asked as we hurried back to our house. "Library archives?" I shook my head, slowing down once we were on the sidewalk. "No, I think it's time we speak to Margaret's husband. See if he can shed any light on what happened that night." Richard Sinclair lived in a stately brick house on the other side of town. As I navigated the tree-lined streets, I mulled over what I had read about him so far. He and Margaret had seemed like the perfect couple, their marriage envied by all. What secrets might lie beneath that glossy surface? I pulled up to the curb, eyeing the manicured lawn and freshly mulched flower beds. Everything looked meticulously maintained, yet there was an air of melancholy that even the bright afternoon sun couldn't disguise. I pressed the doorbell. Chimes echoed within. After a moment, footsteps approached and the door swung open. Richard looked at us with bright yet tired eyes, his wrinkled shirt and slightly tousled white hair suggesting a busy day. Despite his somewhat worn appearance, he had a kind, grandfatherly face that radiated warmth. "Yes?" he asked hoarsely. I introduced us and explained why we were there. He scrutinized me a moment before stepping back and gesturing inside. "You'd better come in." Richard led us into a spacious living room filled with plush furniture and ornate decorations. A lingering grief permeated the space. He motioned for us to sit. As I settled onto the brocade sofa, I studied his hunched posture and the deep lines etched into his forehead and around his mouth. His eyes held a profound sadness. "It's been over 40 years, yet losing Margaret still haunts me," he said, his voice cracking. "She was my whole world." He went on to describe their whirlwind romance and picture-perfect marriage in wistful detail. But as he spoke, I noticed a shiftiness in his gaze and the way he wrung his hands. There was more to this story. Delia leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Is there something you're not telling us?" Richard's shoulders tensed, his eyes darting away. "Yes, Margaret had a friend, Rebecca Collins. They were inseparable for a time. But Rebecca—" He trailed off, looking conflicted. "What about her?" I prodded. He hesitated. "Rebecca was jealous that Margaret won a scholarship to art school. It caused a terrible rift between them." "How terrible?" Delia asked. Rebecca had accused Margaret of sabotaging her art school admissions portfolio and ruining her life. He shook his head. "I can't believe Margaret would have done something so cruel. Not when she knew she'd be dropping out of school to marry me." He stood and walked to Margaret's self-portrait hanging over the fireplace. "Maybe if I'd paid more attention to her back then, this wouldn't have happened." He turned back to us. "My best friend was having serious financial problems and wanted a large loan. I'd told him no several times, but he wouldn't let it go. I was so wrapped up in his problems that maybe I missed something." Delia stood and put a gentle hand on his arm. "You mustn't blame yourself. There was no way you could know what would happen." Glancing at my watch, I stood. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Sinclair. You've given us a lot to think about." He walked us to the door, sorrow etched on his face. I felt bad for bringing up such sad memories, but I doubted he was ever far from them. As we headed to the car, I knew Rebecca Collins was someone we needed to speak with next. And soon. Delia voiced my thoughts aloud. Rebecca could know something about Margaret's murder, maybe even be involved somehow. I nodded. "Let's go see if we can find her at the library before they close." A prickle of unease crept up my spine as we drove away. Which woman was hiding secrets, Rebecca or Margaret? Chapter 4. Delia. The library loomed before us, a hulking beast of brick and mortar. I shivered in the cool spring air, nerves tingling. Thea gave my hand a quick squeeze. "Ready to interrogate our very first suspect." I nodded, throat dry. I had no idea how Isabella did this without freaking out. We climbed the stone steps together, the click of our boots echoing in the stillness. Inside, the silence pressed down, heavy as a soaked blanket. Our footsteps creaked over worn wooden floors, mingling with the whispers of patrons tucked between dusty shelves. Thea tensed beside me, eyes darting to shadowy corners. This hunt for answers already had her on edge. I nudged her with my elbow. "Hey, don't worry. We'll get what we need." Thea nodded, lips pressed thin. We wound through the stacks, past hunched figures scanning pages. The smell of old paper and floor polish tickled my nose. A slender woman with a long braid the color of chestnut stood behind the checkout counter. She glanced up and smiled at us. Her name tag read Rebecca Collins, librarian. I felt like an idiot for even coming to question her. Librarians don't kill people. They're helpers and pillars of the community. "Hello there," Thea said briskly, striding up to the desk. "I'm Thea Proctor, and this is my cousin Delia. We were hoping to have a word with you, Miss Collins." Rebecca's eyes narrowed, flickering between us. "Regarding?" Her voice was smooth as velvet, but with an edge underneath. "The passing of Margaret Sinclair. We understand you two were friends." Rebecca stiffened almost imperceptibly. her knuckles paling on the counter. That was a long time ago. But you do remember her, I pressed gently. Rebecca's gaze swiveled to me. Of course, we were close once. Her words were clipped and tense. Why the interest now? Thea leaned forward, bracing her hands on the worn wood. Let's just say we have our reasons. She paused. We'd love to know more about your falling out. Rebecca held Thea's stare for a taut moment before glancing away. She busied herself placing books on a cart, buying time. The hesitation was telling. She was deciding how much to reveal. When she faced us again, her neutral expression told us nothing. I'm afraid there's not much to tell. We simply grew apart after high school. But the tightness in her jaw betrayed her. There was more to this story. I traded a knowing look with Thea. Time to turn up the heat. I nodded slowly, as if considering her words. That's understandable. But high school friendships often run deep. Losing someone so suddenly can't have been easy. Rebecca's lips thinned. No, her death was difficult. I moved closer, lowering my voice, especially when there were unresolved issues between you. Rebecca's head jerked up, eyes flashing. What exactly are you implying? Only that Margaret's case was never solved. I held her gaze. Loose ends have a way of haunting us all. Rebecca looked away, her jaw tightening. When she spoke, her voice was strained. I had nothing to do with what happened to her. We're not accusing you of anything, Miss Collins, Thea interjected gently. We only want to understand the truth. Rebecca wrapped her arms around herself, as if warding off a chill. She seemed to wrestle with some internal debate before finally letting out a shaky breath. Margaret was my best friend, but people change after high school. Her eyes glistened. We both changed. I thought our bond was unbreakable, but... She trailed off, blinking back tears. Thea pulled a handkerchief from her purse and offered it to Rebecca, who took it with a trembling hand. I'm sorry this is difficult to talk about. Rebecca dabbed at her eyes. Losing her the way we did, without resolution. I've had to live with that regret for so long. Her voice broke on the last word. I felt a twinge of sympathy seeing the rawness of her grief. Perhaps there was more humanity in Rebecca than I'd realized. Thea touched her arm gently. We understand this isn't easy. We just want to find the truth for Margaret's sake and for yours. Rebecca looked up, eyes glistening but resolute. I'll tell you everything I know. If it helps bring Margaret peace, it will have been worth it. She took a steadying breath, preparing to unburden herself at last. Thea and I shared a subtle, triumphant glance. We were finally about to uncover the real story between Margaret and Rebecca. Margaret and I met in art class during our freshman year of high school, Rebecca began. We were both passionate about painting and bonded over our shared love of the arts. We were inseparable for those 4 years, spending every free moment together painting, visiting museums, dreaming about our futures as renowned artists. A wistful smile crossed her face at the memory. I really thought nothing could come between us, but senior year everything changed. Her expression darkened. We both applied for the same prestigious art school scholarship. The winner would receive a full-ride scholarship. It was a huge opportunity. She took a shaky breath, her hands clenching at the memory. I worked so hard on my portfolio. Countless late nights perfecting every brushstroke, pouring my soul into those paintings. I just knew I would get it. Rebecca's eyes flashed with anger. But at the last minute, half my portfolio went missing, crucial pieces that tied everything together. I was devastated, frantic, but it was too late to redo them. I had to submit my application unfinished. Thea and I exchanged a glance. This was a major revelation. In the end, Margaret won the scholarship, Rebecca said bitterly. She swore she had nothing to do with my missing paintings, but I knew she was lying. She sabotaged my chances out of jealousy or competitiveness. I'll never forgive her for stealing my dream. She took a shuddering breath, tears welling in her eyes once more. After that, our friendship was broken beyond repair. We went our separate ways, and I never saw her again after high school. Rebecca lifted her gaze to meet ours, her expression haunted. I thought about reaching out to her after a year, but when I found out she'd dropped out of school to marry Richard, I knew I'd never be able to forgive her. Why not? I asked. Rebecca's eyes flashed with anger she still hadn't let go of. Because she stole my scholarship and then threw it away. She could have done anything that year after high school and wound up with the same life. Instead, she chose to take my one chance at being an artist. Thea handed her another tissue, her brow furrowed in thought. Clearly there was more to this story than we realized. But could a broken friendship really lead to murder? Rebecca, we understand this must be difficult, I said gently. But we need you to think back to those final interactions with Margaret. Are there any other details you can remember that might point us to who killed her? Rebecca dabbed at her eyes, considering. Well, there was one odd incident about a year after high school ended. I did see her once after we graduated at the art supply store downtown. At first I tried to just avoid her, but she actually approached me. My ears perked up at this. What did she say? She told me she had decided not to attend art school after all, that she was giving up painting entirely. Rebecca shook her head. I was shocked. Margaret was incredibly talented. We all knew she had a bright future in the art world. I asked her why, but she just muttered something vague about things changing, and hurried off. I shared a puzzled look with Thea. This was definitely suspicious. One more thing, Rebecca added slowly. A couple weeks before her death, I saw Margaret at the fancy tart. She was arguing with someone else from our graduating class, James Anderson. Can you remember what they were saying? Thea asked. Rebecca thought for a moment. No, I couldn't. I turned around and went to another cafe for my coffee. I wanted nothing to do with her. Thank you, Rebecca. You've been very helpful, I said. We may be in touch if any other questions come up. Please let us know if you remember anything else. Rebecca nodded, seeing us out. As we headed to the car, I could tell Thea's thoughts mirrored my own. This case had taken an intriguing new turn, and we were determined to uncover the full truth. Margaret was counting on us. Thea and I stepped out into the sunny afternoon, our minds swirling with questions after the revealing conversation with Rebecca. Well, that was certainly enlightening, Thea remarked as we walked across the parking lot. It seems Margaret and Rebecca's relationship was more complicated than we realized. I nodded. The scholarship sabotage gives Rebecca a clear motive, but seeing Margaret argue with that James Anderson guy adds a whole new layer. We reached the car and I slid into the driver's seat, cranking the heat to combat the icy wind that had picked up. Thea flipped open her notebook, reviewing the details we'd gathered so far. James Anderson, she mused. Margaret's husband mentioned he was having money problems around the time she died. They must have been arguing over finances. Or maybe an affair, I suggested. If Margaret was buying art supplies, it could mean her marriage wasn't as rosy as people thought and she wanted to go back to school. Thea chewed her lip thoughtfully. We'll need to track down James for questioning. I eased the car onto the road as we both contemplated our next move. The pieces were coming together, but we still had a ways to go. One thing was certain. We were getting closer to the truth, and to bringing justice for Margaret at last. Chapter 5. Thea. The door to Anderson's pub creaked open, casting a sliver of daylight across the dingy hardwood floors. I stepped inside, the heavy aroma of stale beer and cigarette smoke invading my nostrils. Delia scrunched her nose as she followed behind me, the door slamming shut and enveloping us in dim lighting. Glasses clinked and idle chatter filled the space. A few patrons glanced up from their drinks as we made our way to the bar. I slid onto a stool, the cracked leather squeaking under me. What can I get you, ladies? The bartender asked, raising an eyebrow at our out-of-place presence. We're here to speak with James Anderson, I said. Is he around? The bartender jerked his thumb toward a door in the back. Office is back there. Knock first. I hopped off the stool, exchanging a look with Delia. She gave a subtle nod, and we headed for the office door, my fist rapped against the wood, the sound echoing in the narrow hallway. A gruff voice bid us enter. The door creaked open to reveal James sitting behind a cluttered desk, ledger open in front of him. His eyes gleamed at the sight of us. To what do I owe the pleasure? James said slowly, leaning back in his chair. I crossed my arms. We're investigating Margaret Sinclair's murder. We have reason to believe you may know something about what happened that night. James's expression hardened, his jaw clenching. I told the police everything I knew when it happened. Margaret was a friend. Her death devastated me. My eyes bored into his, searching for any hint of deception. But his gaze remained steady, giving nothing away. Delia circled the desk, trailing her fingers along the wood surface. Funny, because our sources saw you arguing with her just prior to her death and claim you were out quite late the night Margaret was killed. She paused, glancing at him sideways, almost like you were establishing an alibi. I tried not to smile. Our sources were the newspaper articles we'd read last night. James's composure finally broke. His eyes blazed with anger. "How dare you accuse me under my own roof?" he seethed through gritted teeth. "Get out!" I grabbed Delia's arm, leading her toward the door. As we left his office, I knew one thing for certain. James Anderson was hiding something about the night Margaret Sinclair was murdered, and we were going to find out what it was. I hesitated at the doorway, glancing back at James. He had slumped in his chair, head in his hands. For a moment, he looked utterly defeated. Delia tugged at my arm, urging me to leave. But something held me there. I let out a sigh. "Look, we don't actually think you killed Margaret," I said, "but we know you're not being completely honest either." James lifted his head, regarding me wearily. "You're right. I didn't kill her, but—" He trailed off, gaze distant. I stepped back into the office, taking the seat opposite him. Delia hovered uncertainly near the door. "But what?" I prompted. James ran a hand over his face. "Margaret found out something about my business, something illegal. She was threatening to go to the police." My eyes widened. "You think she was killed because of that?" He nodded grimly. "I should have come clean sooner, but I was afraid. I didn't kill her, but I'm responsible all the same." I studied him intently. Despite his admission, I sensed no deceit from him now. "We'll keep this between us for now," I said at last, "but we may need to give the police everything we find out. It would be better if you told them first." James held my gaze. "You're right, I'll come clean, I swear it." I stood up and headed for the door, Delia on my heels. We still didn't have all the answers about Margaret's death, but it was a start, and for now that would have to be enough. I nodded, though a seed of doubt still lingered. There was more to this story. I could feel it in my bones. As we turned to leave, James called out, "Wait, there's something else you should know." I paused, glancing back over my shoulder. "What is it?" James hesitated, seeming to wage an internal war with himself. Finally, he said, "It's about Sarah, my ex-wife." Delia and I exchanged a look before retaking our seats. This was unexpected. "Go on," I prompted. "Sarah was obsessed with Richard Sinclair." James began haltingly. "She wanted to leave me for him. When he married Margaret instead, Sarah was furious." He paused, taking a deep breath. "A week before the murder, I heard her screaming into the phone about how Margaret had stolen her life. How she wished Margaret would just disappear." My pulse quickened at his words. Could Sarah have acted on those dark desires? "Why didn't you tell anyone this before?" Delia asked sharply. James dropped his gaze. "Because a part of me still wants to protect her, even now. But you deserve the truth." I considered this new information. Sarah had motive and opportunity. She deserved a visit. I stood up decisively. "Thank you for telling us this, James. We'll be in touch soon." With new purpose, Delia and I strode from the pub. The pieces were coming together, and I was determined to uncover the full truth, no matter where it led. The cool night air was a refreshing change from the stuffy pub interior. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp breeze center my thoughts. "Well, that was unexpected," Delia murmured as we walked briskly to our car. "No kidding," I agreed. "Sarah just became our prime suspect. We need to talk to her as soon as possible." Delia nodded, her blonde and red-tipped hair bouncing with the movement. "Totally. But do you really think she could have done it?" I considered the question, imagining how angry I would be if I thought someone had stolen the love of my life. "I think anyone is capable of murder, given sufficient motive," I said finally. "The question is, did Sarah have reason enough to kill?" "Wanting another woman's husband seems pretty extreme," Delia mused. "I can't imagine hating someone that much." I thought of the seething venom in James's voice as he described Sarah's reaction to Margaret's marriage. Obsession can warp a person, make them see things in black and white with no middle ground. If Sarah felt Margaret stole Richard from her, it could have twisted into a need for revenge. I took a deep breath, trying to clear the ominous thoughts from my mind. Focus on the facts, I told myself. We still had more questions than answers. So where to next? Delia asked, matching my brisk pace down the lamp-lit street. Should we go talk to Sarah? I considered it. My instincts said we weren't ready yet, that we needed more pieces of the puzzle first. Not tonight, I decided. It's late and I don't want to spook her. We should do some more digging before a direct confrontation. Delia nodded. Good thinking. So what's the plan then? I glanced at my watch, noting the late hour. It's too late to follow up on any other leads tonight. Let's head home and get some rest. We can start fresh in the morning. Delia stifled a yawn. Sounds good to me, I'm beat. We drove onto the tree-lined lane leading toward home, both lost in our own thoughts. I replayed the conversation with James in my mind, searching for any clues I might have missed, but all I felt was a growing certainty that we were headed in the right direction. The truth was out there, waiting to be found, and nothing would stop us from uncovering it. Chapter 6. Delia. Thea and I hurried along the sidewalk to Sarah Anderson's house. Our earlier conversation with the pub owner kept replaying in my mind. James had practically gift-wrapped a motive for his ex-wife Sarah to want Margaret dead. Sarah had pined for Richard for years, only to have her dreams shattered when he married Margaret instead. The sting of rejection must have cut deep. As we approached the house, Thea shot me a knowing look. Her eyes blazed with determination as she gave a single, curt nod. My heart pounded, adrenaline flooding my veins. This was it. Time to confront our best suspect yet. I rapped sharply on the door. A shadow passed across the frosted glass. The knob rattled and the door swung open. Sarah's gaze bounced between us, surprise widening her eyes. Thea, Delia, how nice to see you. James called and told me to expect you. Her words were friendly, but her tone held an edge. Thea crossed her arms. We need to talk. Sarah's smile faltered. She stepped back, gesturing for us to enter. I nudged Thea and tipped my head toward the air freshener plugged into the wall. She gave an almost imperceptible nod. Message received. Sarah was trying to mask something. We filed into the living room. Sarah perched on the edge of the floral couch, back ramrod straight. Thea and I took the chairs opposite her. Silence thickened the air. Sarah shifted, smoothing her skirt over her knees. She cleared her throat. Would anyone care for tea? Her voice trembled slightly. She wasn't fooling anyone. Thea leaned forward, eyes narrowed. We know about you and Richard. Sarah froze. Bingo. Sarah's composure cracked, eyes flashing with anger. Me and Richard. She spat his name. There is no me and Richard, not anymore. She surged to her feet, pacing. Her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides. We were supposed to be together. Everyone knew it. But then that little witch came along. She whirled, jabbing an accusing finger toward us. Margaret, with her look at me smile and batting eyelashes, she stole him away. Sarah's voice broke. She slumped back onto the couch, dropping her head in her hands. Her shoulders shook with quiet sobs. Thea and I exchanged a glance but remained silent. After a moment, Sarah lifted her head. Her eyes glistened with tears, but her jaw was set in determination. I wanted her gone. Every day I wished she would just disappear. Her voice hardened. But I didn't kill her. Thea's eyes bored into her. Can you prove that? Sarah wiped her eyes, squaring her shoulders. The night she died, I was at a charity event. James was supposed to join me at the pediatric cancer fundraiser, but he never did. He says he was with Richard, trying to convince him to loan us money. There were at least 50 witnesses at the fundraiser. Her chin lifted in challenge. I wanted Margaret out of my life, but I'm no murderer. Alibi provided. The ball was in our court now. Thea and I stood in unison. Time to dig deeper. I met Sarah's gaze. We'll see about that. Thea and I stepped outside, the door clicking shut behind us. I blew out a long breath, running a hand through my hair. Well, she certainly had motive. Thea nodded, lips pursed in thought. but she seemed genuine about her alibi. We descended the porch steps, gravel crunching under our feet as we made our way to the car. I don't know, I mused. She could be a good actress, all that sobbing and dramatics. Thea paused with her hand on the door handle, looking back at the house. Maybe, but those tears seemed real to me. I leaned against the car, arms crossed. So you think she's telling the truth? About the alibi, it's possible. Thea drummed her fingers on the roof. But she's definitely hiding something. I could see it in her eyes. I agree. I glanced back at the house, an uneasy feeling in my gut. Sarah knows more than she's letting on. We need to dig deeper into this charity event of hers. Thea nodded firmly, and into her connection with Richard. There's more to this love triangle than we're seeing. She opened the car door with renewed purpose. Let's head back and start piecing things together. We're finally getting somewhere with this case. I slid into the passenger seat, feeling the first sparks of excitement. Thea was right. We were circling closer to the truth, one step at a time. So where to first? I asked, rolling down the window to let the breeze hit my face. Research the charity event or talk to Richard again? Thea tapped her fingers on the steering wheel, considering. The event. We should be able to verify her attendance pretty easily. Good thinking. I nodded. Something like that should have had a ton of pictures in the paper. Exactly. Thea's eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. And we'll need to find out more about this grudge against Margaret, too. Just how deep did it go? I chewed my lip in thought. There were so many puzzle pieces still missing. We just had to keep digging. The trees swept past in a blur as we drove, but my mind kept drifting back to Sarah's tear-streaked face. Had that pain been real? Or just a mask to hide her guilt? I sighed, watching the clouds drift across the sky. We were getting closer to the truth. I could feel it in my bones. All we had to do was keep following the trail, one step at a time. I glanced over at Thea, noticing the determined set of her jaw as she drove. This case had become personal for both of us. Margaret deserved justice, and we wouldn't rest until her killer was behind bars. As we turned onto our street, I spotted Margaret's house up ahead. I wondered how she was doing, and if she was impatient for us to find her killer. Chapter 7. Thea. Frustration gnawed at me as I pored over the case notes scattered across my desk. Margaret Sinclair's smiling face peered up at me from a faded photograph, those warm brown eyes brimming with life and joy. The woman in the photo was a far cry from the ghost I'd met in my yard. I shook my head sharply, as if to dislodge the dark thoughts clouding my mind. Delia looked up from her desk. We'll figure it out, I know we will. I frowned. We were in our office at Port City Tours, and she was catching up on the work we'd let fall by the wayside while we were interviewing suspects and chasing down decades-old alibis. I'm getting nowhere. All these dead ends are giving me a killer headache. Delia's hand settled gently on my shoulder. You'll figure it out, Thea. I know you will. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Margaret's counting on us. I met her earnest gaze, managing a small smile. Ever since we were children, she'd always been so full of optimism. If only I could borrow some of that sunny disposition. Maybe you're right, I said, straightening in my chair. I think I'll go have a chat with the chief, see if he can shed some light on a few things. Delia's eyes lit up eagerly. Ooh, I'll come with you. We can stop for donuts on the way. I laughed, the first genuine one all day. Trust Delia to know how to lift my spirits. All right, you've sold me. Let's go. The scent of coffee and stale donuts enveloped me as I pushed through the doors of the police station. Chief Dobbins glanced up from his paperwork, face creasing into a smile. Thea, Delia, this is a pleasant surprise. I slid into the chair across from him, regarding him steadily. My father. Even now the word felt foreign on my tongue. I wasn't quite sure what to make of this man who had only recently told me he was my father, despite having known me all my life. I need your help with a case, I said briskly, cutting off that train of thought. He raised an eyebrow. What case? Did Isabella drag you into something? I shook my head and pulled out my amulet. You know Delia and I got these, but what you didn't know is that they're defective. At least they don't work like everyone else's. Delia and I can see ghosts." I could see his training kick into play as his face assumed a neutral expression that must have been useful in interrogations. "Grandpa asked us to help one of his friends, Margaret Sinclair. She thinks she can't rest until her killer is found," Delia said. I quickly outlined everything I knew so far about Margaret's murder. The chief listened intently, jotting down notes here and there. "I remember this one well," he mused after I had finished. "It troubled me that we never caught her killer. I'll dig through our records again, see if I can uncover any new leads for you. If we don't get it sorted out in the next few days, I'll reopen the case and assign an officer to investigate." "Thank you," Delia said when I didn't respond immediately. "Can't the ghost just tell you who killed her?" I closed my eyes for a moment. If only it were that simple. Unfortunately, no. She can't remember anything from that day. I suspect it's too traumatic for her. Anything you can find would be a big help. We're at a dead end with our suspects." Chief Dobbins studied me for a long moment, his eyes softening. "You have your grandmother's determination and your mother's heart, Thea. We'll get to the bottom of this, I promise you that." I ducked my head to hide the sudden burn of tears. That meant more to me than I could ever express. I cleared my throat gruffly. "Well, thank you. We should get going." As I stood to leave, the chief rose as well. Before I could react, he had enveloped me in a brief, fierce hug. "I'm proud of you, Thea," he murmured. "Don't ever forget that." I blinked rapidly, throat tight. Without a word, I slipped out the door, my father's embrace still lingering like a bittersweet ache around me. I left the police station in a daze, my father's unexpected show of affection swirling through my mind. Our relationship was still so new, so tentative, that any glimpse of warmth from him left me reeling. As we drove toward Proctor House, I mulled over everything Chief Dobbins and I had discussed. He was willing to reopen the case file on Margaret's murder and search for any clues that might have been initially overlooked. With his experience and the evidence Delia and I had uncovered, surely we could piece together the truth. I quickened my pace, eager to share the developments with my grandfather. He would be thrilled to hear my father was now an ally in our investigation. Together, the three of us would dig into every facet of Margaret's life until we uncovered who killed her and why. Once I parked the car, W broke into a jog to the house, our excitement propelling me forward. Grandpa must have seen me coming because he appeared on the front porch, brow furrowed. "What's going on?" he asked as I bounded up the steps. "You look like you just won the lottery." I grinned, slightly breathless. Even better, the chief's going to help us solve Margaret's murder. Grandpa's eyes widened. "No way, that's amazing news. Come on, let's celebrate with some tea and figure out our next move." Hooking her arm through mine, Delia led me inside, chattering a mile a minute about how close we were to finding Margaret's killer. But my thoughts kept returning to my father, and the belief he had expressed in me. For the first time, I truly felt like we had a chance to uncover the truth about Margaret Sinclair's death. As Delia busied herself making tea, I sank down in a chair, gnawing my bottom lip. There were still so many unanswered questions. What had Margaret discovered that got her killed? Who wanted her dead badly enough to commit murder? And most importantly, why? "Grandpa," Delia said, "I know you don't eat, but can you smell things?" He looked puzzled. "Why do you ask?" "Well," she said sheepishly, "if there was something you wanted to be reminded of, flowers, your favorite food, whatever, we could help out with that." "You're on the right track, kiddo," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "Keep digging and you'll get to the truth." I smiled. "We will, Grandpa. I know we're close now." He nodded, flickering as he began to fade. "All you girls have good instincts, so trust them. And trust your father, too. Dobbins may seem gruff, but he cares a great deal about you." With those final words of encouragement, Grandpa's ghostly apparition disappeared. Delia set a steaming mug down in front of me. "All right, let's go over what we know so far. There's got to be something we're still missing." I took a bracing sip of tea, savoring the warmth. We were so close to the truth I could taste it. I nodded, gathering my thoughts. Okay, so based on what Margaret's husband Richard told us, we knew Rebecca Collins had a major grudge against Margaret, They were competing for some big art scholarship back in high school, and Margaret ended up winning. Delia shook her head. But still, killing someone over a high school competition seems extreme even for a grudge. There's got to be more to it, I said. Remember how shifty Rebecca got when we asked about their past? She's definitely hiding something. I glanced out the window, watching the rain patter against the glass. Somewhere out there, a killer was walking free. The kitchen door burst open with a blast of cold air that sent a chill down my spine. Chief Dobbins strode in, his trench coat billowing behind him like a cape. "Ladies," he announced, "I have what you need." With a dramatic flourish, he slapped the manila file folder down on the coffee table. Thea and I huddled close, our breaths held in suspense. I couldn't tear my eyes from that file, its contents the key to unlocking this mystery. "Well, don't just stand there gawking," Chief Dobbins said. "Have at it." Thea fumbled with the cover, her hands shaking. I wedged my fingers under the flap and ripped it open. The crisp pages fanned out before us. Names, dates, evidence inventories, each one a piece to the puzzle. I traced my finger down the list of suspects. Richard Sinclair, Sarah Anderson, James Anderson. The names blurred together. They all had solid alibis? "Yes," he said. I tapped the name at the bottom of the list. "Then I guess we'd better have a chat with Rebecca Collins." Thea nodded, her eyes flashing with determination. "Let's go get some answers." We gathered our things and headed for the door, Chief Dobbins trailing behind. As we stepped outside, the spring chill bit through my sweater. I shivered and glanced up at the slate-gray sky. It matched the somber mood that had settled over us. At the curb sat the chief's cruiser, engine rumbling. He held the back door open for us with an exaggerated bow. "Your chariot awaits." I slid across the leather seat, inhaling the smells of coffee and worn upholstery. Thea clambered in after me. As Chief Dobbins settled behind the wheel, dread curdled in my stomach. We were really doing this, confronting a killer. The engine roared as we pulled away from the curb. I stared out the window, watching familiar houses and trees streak by in a blur. Thea fidgeted beside me, cracking her knuckles one by one. I knew she was just as nervous as I was. We turned onto Elm Street, the rows of quaint shops and cafes giving way to a seedier part of town. Ramshackle apartments loomed, laundry lines strung between windows. My pulse quickened. We were getting close. The cruiser rolled to a stop outside a peeling blue building. I craned my neck, looking for apartment 12. Rebecca's apartment. It was time to get some answers. The engine cut off, enveloping us in tense silence. I took a deep breath, steeling my nerves as I stepped out onto the cracked sidewalk. Thea and Chief Dobbins joined me, their faces etched with determination. We approached the building entrance, the creaking door revealing a dingy hallway. I wrinkled my nose at the stale air as we climbed the stairs single file. The chief led the way, one hand resting casually on his holstered gun. My mouth went dry. This was really happening. We halted outside apartment 12, exchanging resolute glances. Chief Dobbins rapped his knuckles against the scarred door. We held our breath, muscles coiled tight as footsteps shuffled inside. The door creaked open, revealing a sallow face framed by lank hair. Rebecca Collins. Her eyes widened at the sight of us, lips parting in surprise. Before she could react, the chief stepped forward. "We need to talk," he rumbled, authority ringing through each syllable. Rebecca paled, clutching the doorframe with white knuckles. Her darting eyes betrayed her panic. I felt a thrill of excitement. We had her on the ropes now. The chief gently propelled her back into the apartment, Thea and I close behind. The inside of the apartment belied her crisp, professional appearance at the library. Clothes were strewn all around the living room, and dirty dishes littered the coffee table. Rebecca perched on a faded armchair, wringing her hands. "What's this about?" Her voice quavered. The chief leaned against the wall, arms folded across his barrel chest. "I think you know." His steely gaze bored into her. "We have some questions about Margaret Sinclair's murder." A violent tremor shook Rebecca's body. The web was drawing tight around her. I could almost taste her fear, metallic on my tongue. She had nowhere left to hide. The truth would come out. I watched Rebecca closely as the chief began his interrogation. Her face was ashen, eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. "Where were you the night Margaret was killed?" the chief asked. Rebecca's throat bobbed as she swallowed. I was at a fundraiser." The chief's eyes narrowed. "The pediatric cancer fundraiser. Can anyone confirm that?" Her voice caught. "I don't know, it was so long ago." Thea circled behind Rebecca's chair, hands clasped behind her back. "We know about the art school, Rebecca," she said softly. "We know Margaret sabotaged your portfolio. She cost you your dream." Rebecca jerked, breath hissing between her teeth. "How could you—" She trailed off, sinking back into the chair. The chief's voice was gentle but firm. "It's time to tell us the truth. No more lies." Rebecca's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. She buried her head in her hands, shoulders shaking with sobs. "I didn't mean to," she choked out. "I just wanted to talk to her. But when she laughed about the portfolio, I lost control." She raised her head, eyes pleading. "I didn't plan to kill her. You have to believe me." My pulse quickened. This was it. The confession we'd been waiting for. Justice for Margaret was close now. I hesitated, almost overwhelmed by the urge to embrace Rebecca, to comfort her in her anguish. But the image of Margaret's lifeless body flashed in my mind, stealing my resolve. Justice first. Thea moved to stand beside me, radiating strength and purpose. "Tell us everything, Rebecca," she said firmly. "Don't leave anything out." Rebecca wiped her tears, taking a shuddering breath. "I went to Margaret's that night to plead with her one last time, to beg her to admit what she'd done and ask the school to take me when she quit." Her voice hardened. "She said her lying had gotten me what I deserved, that I didn't have what it takes to be an artist. That's when I lost it." She closed her eyes, fresh tears slipping free. I followed her up to her bedroom. There were nylons draped on the bed, and suddenly they were in my hand. And then... She mimed a strangling motion, then wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly. The chief straightened, hand drifting to his hip near his gun. "So you admit you strangled Margaret Sinclair that night, causing her death?" Rebecca looked up at him, eyes overflowing but clear. "Yes," she whispered. "I killed her." The chief nodded, gaze gentle but resolute. "Rebecca Collins, you're under arrest for the murder of Margaret Sinclair." As he recited her rights, I let out a long breath. We'd done it, brought Margaret's killer to justice. Though part of me ached for Rebecca's pain, a greater part rejoiced that Margaret could finally rest in peace. Chapter 8. Delia. The night air was still, not a breeze disturbing the trees, as Grandpa, Thea, and I arrived at the edge of the Proctor property. We stood beneath the ancient oak, its gnarled branches stretching toward the sky like arthritic fingers. I shivered, though not from the cold. Grandpa nodded, his eyes fixed on the space before us. "Margaret," Thea called softly. "We're here." A wisp of mist gathered, slowly solidifying into the ghostly form of a woman. Margaret. She was as lovely as I remembered, her gentle smile warming me. "You came," she said. "I wasn't sure." "Of course," Thea replied. "We promised we'd help you find peace." I stepped forward. "We can never thank you enough for trusting us with your story, for giving us the chance to make things right." Margaret's eyes glistened. "My spirit can rest easy now, thanks to you both. I'm not certain if I want to know the truth about my death." Thea and I exchanged a glance. "If it helps," I said. "She didn't mean to kill you." Margaret's lips turned up into a small smile. "So it was Rebecca, wasn't it?" Grandpa reached out and took her hand. "Everything will be okay from now on. The girls will make sure Richard knows. Now it's time for you to go." The mist swirled, enveloping Margaret's form in a diaphanous haze. Her edges grew indistinct as she gave us a final, loving smile. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice echoing softly. "For everything." I blinked back tears as she dissolved before us, dissipating like smoke on the wind. A peaceful silence descended, broken only by the rustling of leaves overhead. Thea slipped her hand into mine, squeezing gently. I knew she felt it too, the bittersweet mix of sadness and satisfaction. We'd helped Margaret move on, but saying goodbye still hurt. "We did good," Thea said finally, her voice hushed. I nodded, not quite trusting my words. Margaret was at rest now, the decades-old mystery of her murder finally solved. We'd brought her justice, fulfilled our promise. Taking a deep breath, I turned to Grandpa. His faded form hovered nearby, pride and gratitude etched on his weathered face. She's free, he murmured. You girls, I knew you could do it. He managed a tremulous smile. I'm going to miss her, but it feels right, doesn't it? We left the old oak behind, its branches creaking in the breeze. Fog swirled around us as we made our way back, each lost in our own thoughts. Margaret's presence still lingered, a whisper on the wind. Isabella was waiting in the kitchen, concern furrowing her brow. There you are. I was getting worried, she said, ushering us inside. The warmth of the kitchen enveloped me, chasing away the night's chill. Isabella bustled about, putting a kettle on to boil. Well, she prompted. How did it go? Thea and I shared a weary smile. It's done, I said simply. Margaret has moved on. Isabella's eyes widened. Incredible. To think after all these years. The kettle whistled, jolting us from our reverie. Isabella poured 3 mugs of steaming chamomile tea and joined us in the living room. So tell me everything, she said, leaning forward eagerly. I want to hear all about how you helped Margaret's spirit move on. Well, it started a few nights ago when Grandpa took us out to meet Margaret, Thea began. We took turns recounting the events, from Grandpa's plea for help to our encounter with Margaret beneath the old oak. Isabella listened intently, gasping and murmuring at all the right moments. Isabella shook her head in wonder. Amazing. Simply amazing. She fixed us with an intent look. Just think of all the spirits out there who need help like Margaret did. With your gifts, you could make such an impact. I paused, struck by her words. She had a point. Our abilities could be used for so much good. Thea looked thoughtful. I never considered taking on cases like that, but now... She trailed off, possibilities turning in her mind. Just imagine it, Isabella said enthusiastically. Thea and Delia, paranormal detectives, helping tormented souls find peace. I had to laugh at her grandiose phrasing, but the more I considered it, the more intrigued I became. It would be an incredible chance to use our talents to create real change. Thea met my eyes, a spark of excitement in her gaze. It could be an amazing new chapter for us, she said slowly. If we work together... Warmth rushed through me. You know I'm with you, I said, grinning. We're an unstoppable team. Thea smiled, gripping my hand. Isabella beamed. This is so exciting. We have to start planning right away. Now, what sort of cases should you take on first? As Isabella chattered enthusiastically, Thea and I shared a look of perfect understanding. The future suddenly seemed rich with possibility. Our gifts had opened an unexpected door. This has been Cold Shadows, a Ghost Whisperers of Portsmouth Cozy Paranormal Mystery. Book 0. Written by Lisa Bouchard. Copyright 2024 by Lisa Bouchard. Production copyright by Lisa Bouchard.